All right, today we are in Ruth chapter 2. Just want to recap Ruth chapter 1. Of course, the main problem was that there's a famine, and so Elimelech and Naomi went to Moab to find food. While they were there, Elimelech died, and along the way, Naomi's two sons died, but before they died, they had taken wives from Moab, Orpah and Ruth. And they didn't have any children, even though they were married for years. So that's another problem, is that barrenness. Eventually, Naomi hears that the Lord had visited his people and sent food back to the people of Israel and Judah. And so she determines to go back to her homeland, to her hometown of Bethlehem. But she tries to convince her daughters-in-law to stay in Moab. Orpah does, but Ruth clings to her and wants to belong to the people of Judah and even worship the God of Israel. And when they return to Bethlehem, it says it's the beginning of barley harvest. Mike Sackenfeld notes that the time of barley harvest and the wheat harvest is April and May, beginning about with the Feast of Passover and ending with the Feast of Weeks, also known as Pentecost. So it's kind of interesting. It's during our time right now. Let's just read chapter 2, verse 1. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. This is information the narrator is giving to the reader to prepare us for the events and the conversations that will take place in chapter 2. We are not to suppose that Naomi at this point is actively seeking to make things happen between Ruth and Boaz. This information is just strictly from the narrator to us, the reader. Okay, so now we'll read verses 2 through 3. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she sent out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. Just want to note, Ruth is called Ruth the Moabite, and she always is, and people always emphasize she's the one from Moab. This is Ruth the Moabite. That does not allow us as readers to forget her status as a foreigner, and that we need to remember that to make sense of everything in this whole book. What do these verses show us about Ruth? Well, I think they show us that Ruth takes initiative. She clung to Naomi and decided to go back to Bethlehem with her, probably to care for this widow. And now she's making good on her intentions. It's harvest time, and she's obviously heard of this gleaning, a way to provide for the poor. And Ruth is the one who says, "I'm going to go gleaning today in the field of someone who might look upon me with favor." And Naomi doesn't take the initiative, maybe we shouldn't read too much into that, but at the end of chapter 1, Naomi is in a state of bitterness and despair. So it's good to see Ruth take the initiative here, not just to care for herself, but to care for her mother-in-law as well. How do we see God's providence at work in verse 3? Well, it says, "So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech." Remember, Naomi didn't say, "Hey, I've got this relative who might redeem us, if we play our cards right." Naomi doesn't tell her any of that. Ruth just happens to come into this field of Boaz, who we're told in verse 1 is a relative of the clan of Elimelech. So this is already setting the stage for us. We're seeing the Lord's providence at work. Now let's read verses 4 through 7. "And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, 'The Lord be with you.' And they answered, 'The Lord bless you.' Then Boaz said to his young man, who is in charge of the reapers, 'Whose young woman is this?' And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, 'She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab.' She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers.' So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest." Sackenfeld writes, now in further apparent coincidence, Boaz just happens to come out to the field to check on the progress of the work. And so this is another way that indicates the Lord's providence. Not only does Ruth go to Boaz's field, but maybe Boaz wasn't always there, but my Bible says, and behold, take note of this. Behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. Okay? What does verse 4 show us about the faith and character of Boaz? Well, the first thing he says to his workers is, the Lord be with you. Isn't that a great way to greet people and to greet those working for you? The Lord be with you. And they answered him, the Lord bless you. Okay, this shows us the faith and character of the man Boaz. In verse 6, what does the servant emphasize about Ruth? Well, I see that he calls her a Moab. Look at the young Moabite woman who came back from Moab. And so again, two times emphasizing, that she's from Moab. What else does the servant say that commends Ruth in verse 7? Well, he tells Boaz what she said. Let me glean. And then he says, so she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. And I think that indicates her work ethic, her character, hard work, things like that. We'll go on to verses 8 through 9. Then Boaz said to Ruth, now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. And here we see that Boaz is is going above and beyond what's expected to show kindness to Ruth. Now, when I say above and beyond, it's not like I am really aware of what was normal in those days for what landowners should do to gleaners. My commentator mentions the same thing. She says it's hard to really know what was customary, but all these verses indicate that Boaz is showing extraordinary kindness to Ruth here. I like just to point out a few things. Keep close to my young women. Keep reaping in my field. Maybe it was customary for gleaners to work a little bit under one landowner, then go to another. He said, no, just keep in my field. And then he says, I charge the young men not to touch you, meaning, not to assault you. And Ruth was, single, and from another country. She didn't have a father to protect her or a husband to protect her. Maybe in those days it was all too common for women to get assaulted sexually by men. And so Boaz strictly charges his men not to touch her, kind of stepping in and playing that either father role or just protector role here. What else do we have? Sackenfeld writes that the verb translated keep close in verse 8, when it says keep close to my young women, keep close is the same verb that earlier expressed Ruth's clinging to Naomi in 1:14. That's when it said Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. I guess that's the same verb as here in chapter 2:8, where Boaz said keep close to my young women. So there, back in chapter 1, Ruth's clinging or closeness to Naomi expressed her affection and protective care for Naomi. Now the same term is used as advice from Boaz to Ruth to protect and provide for her. Let's go on to verses 10 through 12. Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? But Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. So Ruth is surprised at the kindness of Boaz. Specifically, she says, since I am a foreigner, right? This is not to be expected for an Israelite man to be so generous to a poor reaper, or a poor gleaner, that is, much less one who is from another country like Moab. So that just accents Boaz's faithful character. But then, what does Boaz praise Ruth for? He praises Ruth for all that she has done for her mother-in-law, leaving her home country to come and be with this widow to help her in this tough life, to bear her burdens. And Boaz says this is a very noble thing for Ruth to do. And how did Boaz learn about this? Well, earlier in the book, it talked about, how the whole city was stirred up when Naomi returned, and once they found out, who was this Moabite with her, I'm pretty sure things went through the Bethlehem grapevine pretty quickly, and that's how Boaz learned about this. What else sticks out to us from verse 12? Just Boaz's response to Ruth when he says, "The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." And a few things stick out to me is that, as I read this chapter, it seems like Ruth is beginning to take refuge under the wings of Boaz. But here Boaz sees the ultimate truth, is that Ruth has really come to take refuge under the wings of the Lord, the God of Israel. And this truth reflects how, in chapter 1, at the end, Ruth committed to worshiping Naomi's God. Your God will be my God. Now Yahweh, the God of Israel, is her God. She has taken refuge under this God. And now Boaz prays that the Lord will give her a full reward. It's interesting because this full reward is going to come through the means of Boaz. God is going to use Boaz to bless Ruth and to bless Naomi. Sometimes we can pray for someone's well-being, and God actually wants us to be his instrument to bless the person we're praying for. That's what happens here, at least. Let's read verse 13. Then she said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and have spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." So it's like Ruth acknowledges that Boaz is treating her like one of his own, even though she's not. And Sackenfeld writes that the storyteller is inviting readers to enjoy their knowledge of Boaz's kinship relation to Naomi, information not yet known to Ruth. In fact, Ruth is much more than a servant to Boaz, but here she still speaks from her ignorance. And that's interesting because Naomi and likely Boaz is aware that, they're relatives. Of course they're aware that they're related. Ruth doesn't yet know this, but Boaz does. And so maybe that is why he is treating her so kindly, because he knows he does have some family, obligation or duty to take care of whoever's with Naomi, the widow of his deceased relative Elimelech. We'll go on, verses 14 through 16. And at mealtime Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain. And she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean. And do not rebuke her." And so here, you don't have to know anything about the customs of gleaning in those days to just recognize that, wow, Boaz is going way above and beyond to be generous to Ruth, making sure that not only she has enough to eat, but also he knows that she has a mother-in-law who is a widow, and giving her enough for her as well. And that's why he gives her so much roasted grain to eat. And that's why he has his men pull out some of the grain and just purposely leave it on the ground for Ruth to pick up. In verse 14, it says, "And she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over." And I happen to think of when Jesus fed the 5,000, Matthew, when he was writing his narrative of that miracle, maybe he purposely echoed that phrase. Because in Matthew 14, verse 20, after Jesus fed the 5,000, it says, "And they all ate and were satisfied, and they took up 12 baskets full of the broken pieces left over." So again, this is the picture of the abundant miracle and abundant provision of Jesus for the Israelites. And here in a very small way, Boaz does the same sort of thing for Ruth and for Naomi. Let's go to verses 17 and 18. So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. The commentary says this amount, an ephah of barley, was about 42 quarts, and it could feed 2 people for about 5 to 7 days. Sackenfeld writes that Boaz's generosity is evident, but it is not sufficient to reverse Naomi and Ruth's economic hardship. They are better off than a day ago, but the future remains bleak unless a longer-term solution can be put in place. Well, that's true. It's not a permanent solution, and that will come later in chapters 3 and 4. But this is, I think the point here is that Boaz, again, provides for Ruth and Naomi, not just for the day, but for the coming days, and as we'll see, for the whole harvest season. Let's go on to read verses 19 and 20. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, "The man names with whom I work today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." And so this passage, especially verse 19, shows that Naomi did not plan this or tell Ruth where to go. She didn't even know where Ruth was that day. But she knows that whoever it was is a great guy, a very generous guy to give all this grain to Ruth. And then notice in verse 19 how the suspense is drawn out. The name Boaz is saved for the very end of the verse. It's in English and in Hebrew, meant to draw out the suspense until the word Boaz comes out of Ruth's mouth. And how does Naomi respond after hearing that it was the field of Boaz? Well, she says, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." This is a wonderful statement of faith. We remember in chapter 1, Naomi seemed to be just incredibly bitter and in despairing of all hope. But now she's realizing that her fortunes are changing. And what changed her attitude is just this generosity from Boaz, which Naomi recognizes as ultimately generosity from the Lord. Back in chapter 1, verse 8, Naomi prayed for her daughters-in-law, trying to get them to go back to their homes. She said, "May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me." So she wanted the Lord to take care of her daughters-in-law back in Moab. She didn't see how they would be taken care of if they came with her to Bethlehem. But here, Ruth has come with her to Bethlehem, and now she recognizes how the Lord in his kindness has not forsaken them, but is showing them abundant, steadfast love and provision. This is changing her attitude completely. Notice at the end of verse 20, Naomi tells Ruth that Boaz is a close relative, one of our redeemers. My study Bible says that family redeemers were relatives obliged to buy back family members from debt slavery or to redeem their fields if they had to sell them. The family redeemer would also receive restitution on behalf of a deceased family member or pursue his killer to ensure that justice was served. He might also raise up a child for the deceased relative in order to maintain the connection between the clan and the relative's hereditary property, though Boaz had no legal obligation to act in this way. And so again, this information is taken from other Bible passages that were written in the Pentateuch, like Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But what we're reading in Ruth is during the time of the judges. And so even though one thing's written down in the Pentateuch, customs have changed some, right, as they always do. And so it's not exactly the same situation that we read in Ruth as when we look back in the Pentateuch at those passages about redeemers. But nonetheless, Boaz is a redeemer. He is related to Elimelech, who died, and so he has some sort of duty, perhaps, to take care of Naomi and now Ruth, who is with her. So that's informative for us. Now let's look at verses 21 through 23. And Ruth the Moabite said, "Besides, he said to me, 'You shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest.' And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, 'It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted.' So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law." So here we see that, again, it wasn't just providing for them for a day. It was going to last throughout all barley and wheat harvests, that Boaz wanted Ruth to keep doing the same thing, and no doubt his men would keep giving her generous portions of grain, and again he commanded them. Well, Naomi thought this was good because then Ruth wouldn't be assaulted in another field. So again we see Boaz's generosity and already taking Ruth and Naomi under his wing. But Boaz himself saw it as taking refuge under the wings of the Lord. And here's how we can begin to compare Boaz to Christ again. God is the one who saves us, but through whom does he save us? He saves us through Jesus Christ, through his generosity, through his death for our sins, which have redeemed us, poor sinners, and bought us back from slavery and from being a foreigner, estranged from the people of God. Jesus has given us more than enough so that we are satisfied and have enough left over, and he has protected us from our enemies of the devil. And so in these ways and more, God has brought refuge, or has brought salvation to us through Jesus, and we have taken refuge under God, under God's wings, specifically under the wings of his Son, Jesus Christ. Now, Luther says that after we have come to faith and freely received generous gifts from Jesus, that we are then to become little Christs to one another, giving freely to others as we have freely received. Therefore, we can also imitate Boaz like that. When people come in our lives that we can help, we can become like a Boaz to them, or like a Christ to them, and go over and above what is expected of us in being generous to those who are in need. God's peace be with you. Amen.